Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood alone at the observation deck of the small human vessel called the Starward Hope, watching the massive space station grow larger against the endless black of space, and she felt her heart beat faster with every passing second as the structure came into view. The station was called the Grand Assembly, and it served as the center of all galactic civilization, a place where 47 different species came together to govern the stars and maintain peace across thousands of worlds. And Alina had seen images of it before, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer size of this place that hung in the void like a metal moon. She had been chosen as humanity's ambassador to the galactic conquered 3 years ago, and in that time she had learned many things about the galaxy and the beings who lived in it, and the most important lesson was simple. Nobody cared about humans, not really, because humanity was young and small and had only discovered faster-than-light travel 18 years before. 18 years was nothing to species who counted their history in millions of years, and to them, humans were like children who had just learned to walk, cute perhaps and interesting in their own way, but not worthy of serious attention or respect. The door behind her opened with a soft hiss, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chen walked in, his boots clicking against the metal floor as he came to stand beside her at the wind. "We are approaching the docking bay, Ambassador," he said in his calm and steady voice. "The station has granted us permission to land in Section 47. Alina nodded but did not turn away from the view, her eyes fixed on the thousands of ships that moved around the station like tiny insects around a hive, each one carrying beings from worlds she had never seen and probably never would. "Have you read the latest intelligence reports?" she asked quietly. Marcus was silent for a moment before answering. "I have, Ambassador, and I wish I could say the information was wrong, but our sources are reliable." The information was about the Vreth Dominion, a species from the far eastern spiral of the galaxy, a region that remained largely unexplored by the conquered and its member species. And for the past several decades, the Vreth had been doing something terrible. They had been conquering worlds, not through diplomacy or trade or cultural exchange, but through war and death and fire, sweeping across the fringe systems like a plague and leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. And the few survivors who escaped told stories that made Alina's blood run cold. Stories of cities burning under orbital bombardment, of families torn apart, of entire civilizations erased from existence because they did not meet the Vreth definition of worthy life. Alina had gathered all the evidence she could find over the past 2 years, intercepted communications and survivor testimonies, and satellite images of worlds that had once been green and blue and were now nothing but scorched rock. And she had requested this emergency session with the Galactic Council to present what she had learned. The Council had given her 15 minutes. 15 minutes to convince ancient beings who had never known war that a storm was coming, that everything they had built over 3,000 years of peace was about to be tested in ways they could not imagine. "Do you think they will listen?" Marcus asked. Alina finally turned away from the window and looked at her aide with tired eyes. "No, I do not think they will listen, but I have to try anyway because that is what humans do. We try even when the odds are against us." The Starward Hope docked at the station 20 minutes later, and Alina walked through the airlock into a world that seemed designed to make her feel small and insignificant. The corridors of the Grand Assembly were enormous, built to accommodate species of all sizes from the tiny Kelish, who stood no taller than her knee, to the massive Torvani who could have crushed her with a single hand. And the walls were decorated with art and symbols from 1,000 different cultures. Everywhere she looked she saw aliens, beings of crystal and light and liquid metal and flesh, and things she had no words for, all of them moving with purpose through the halls of power, and none of them gave her more than a passing glance. To them she was just another human, a member of that young and foolish species that had stumbled into the stars, without understanding how things worked out here. She made her way to the council chamber with Marcus at her side, passing through security checkpoints manned by the Valorian Guard, tall and stern warriors in gleaming armor who served as the peacekeepers of the conquered. The chamber itself was a vast circular room with seats arranged in rising tiers around a central platform, and as Alina entered, she saw that most of the seats were empty because this emergency session was considered a minor matter unworthy of full attendance. High Arbiter Thesson sat at the highest tier, a being of living crystal whose form caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across the walls, and the Arbiter had led the council for over 600 years and was considered the wisest being in known space. Alina took her place at the central platform and looked up at the scattered delegates who had bothered to attend, seeing boredom in their alien faces and impatience in the way they shifted in their seats. The council recognizes Ambassador Alina Vasquez of the Human Coalition, Thesson said in a voice like wind chimes. You have requested this session to present information regarding the Vreth Dominion. You may proceed. Alina took a deep breath and began to speak, projecting images and data onto the holographic displays around her as she told them everything she knew. She showed them the intercepted communication where Vreth commanders discussed the extermination of inferior species. She played the testimonies of survivors who had watched their families die. She displayed the satellite images of burning worlds and mass graves and cities reduced to rubble. She spoke for her full 15 minutes, and when she finished the chamber was silent. Then Ambassador Krelvoth of the Synthari rose from his seat, a being of pale blue skin and large dark eyes, whose species had achieved perfect logic millennia ago, and considered themselves the intellectual masters of the galaxy. The data you have presented is incomplete, he said in his cold and measured voice. These events occurred in regions outside conquered jurisdiction, and we cannot verify the accuracy of your sources. Furthermore, the Vreth have made no hostile moves toward any conquered member world. Because they are not ready yet, Alina replied, fighting to keep her frustration under control. They are building their strength, consolidating their conquests before they move against us. The Melori delegate spoke next, a being of flowing liquid metal who could reshape their form at will. Humanity has been part of galactic civilization for less than 2 decades. You do not have the perspective to understand how these matters work. The conquered has faced many perceived threats over the millennia, and patience and diplomacy have always prevailed. Alina wanted to scream at them, to grab them by their shoulders and shake them until they understood. But she knew that would only prove their point about humans being primitive and emotional. I am telling you that war is coming, she said as calmly as she could manage. The Vreth will not stop until they have conquered everything. High Arbiter Thesson made a soft chiming sound that signaled the end of discussion. The Council thanks the human delegation for their vigilance. We will continue to monitor the situation through appropriate channels. This session is concluded. And just like that, it was over. Alina stood alone on the platform as the delegates filed out, not one of them looking back at her, not one of them caring about the evidence she had shown or the warnings she had given. Marcus was waiting outside the chamber with a secured tablet in his hands and a grim expression on his face. Ambassador, our long-range sensors just detected something, he said quietly so no one else could hear. A Vreth war fleet, 400 vessels strong. They will reach the outer colonies in 6 weeks. Alina felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like a physical burden, because she had known this moment would come, but knowing did not make it easier. They are not going to help us, she said, looking back at the empty chamber. They do not believe the threat is real. What do we do? Alina took the tablet from his hands and looked at the data, at the massive fleet that was even now moving toward everything she loved, and she made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. We prepare, she said with steel in her voice, alone if we have to. The days that followed Elena's failed presentation to the council were filled with frustration and growing despair, and she spent long hours in her small office on the station, sending messages to Earth and receiving reports that only confirmed her worst fears. The Vreth fleet was moving faster than anyone had expected, cutting through the empty space between the stars with a hunger that could not be satisfied, and every day brought them closer to the worlds that humanity had worked so hard to build. Elena requested another meeting with the council, then another and another, but each time she was told that the matter was under review and that the proper procedures had to be followed before any action could be taken. The proper procedures could take months, sometimes years, because the Galactic Concord had been built on the idea that patience was always better than haste, and that violence was never the answer to any problem. She tried meeting with individual delegates in private, hoping that one-on-one conversations might convince them where her public presentation had failed, but the results were always the same. Ambassador Krelvoth of the Synthari listened politely to her arguments, and then explained in his cold, logical way that the probability of the Vreth attacking conquered space was too low to justify military preparation, and that humans simply lacked the mathematical understanding to properly assess risk. The Melori delegate was even worse, suggesting that Elena's concerns were the result of humanity's primitive fear response, and that with time her species would evolve past such emotional reactions. "You are like children afraid of shadows," the Melori said with what might have been a kind smile if liquid metal could smile. "The galaxy is not as dangerous as you believe." Elena wanted to show them the faces of the survivors she had interviewed, the mothers who had watched their children die, the fathers who had lost everything. But she knew it would make no difference because these beings had never known loss like that. 3,000 years of peace had made them soft and blind, unable to see the darkness that was coming because they had forgotten that darkness existed. 2 weeks after her first presentation, something happened that Elena had been dreading and hoping for at the same time. The Conquered received a message from the Vreth Dominion. It was the first official communication between the two powers, and the Council immediately called an emergency session that was actually well attended, because everyone was curious about these mysterious conquerors from the Eastern Spiral. Elena sat in the observer section with Marcus beside her, watching as High Arbiter Thesson activated the holographic display and played the recorded message for all to see. The Vreth commander who appeared on the screen was terrifying in a way that went beyond physical appearance, tall and covered in dark scales with 4 arms and a face full of sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that made Elena's blood run cold. Those eyes held nothing, no mercy, no compassion, no recognition that the beings watching might be anything other than obstacles to be removed. "We are the Vreth Dominion," the commander said in a voice that had been translated into the common galactic language but still carried an alien coldness. "We have claimed the Eastern territories as our own, and we will soon expand our righteous domain into the space you call the Conquered." A murmur went through the chamber, but Thesson raised a crystalline hand for silence. "You have a choice," the Vreth continued. "Submit to our rule and accept your place as servants of the Dominion, or resist and be destroyed. We give you this warning as a courtesy because we believe it is right to offer the weak a chance to surrender before we crush them." The message ended, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Ambassador Krelvoth rose from his seat with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime believing in the power of reason. "This is clearly a negotiating tactic. The Vreth are attempting to establish a strong position before discussions begin. We should respond with a diplomatic envoy to open formal talks." Elena could not believe what she was hearing. "Did you watch the same message I did? They are not interested in negotiation. They are telling us to surrender or die." "Ambassador Vasquez, please," Thesson said with a disapproving chime. Outbursts of this nature are not helpful. The Council will handle this matter through established channels. The established channels turned out to be exactly what Krelvoth had suggested. A diplomatic envoy consisting of 3 ships and 12 ambassadors from different species, sent to meet with the Vreth and establish a framework for peaceful coexistence. Alina begged them not to send the envoy, warning them that the Vreth would see it as weakness and respond with violence. But no one listened to the young human who had only been in space for 18 years. The envoy departed 4 days later with great ceremony and high hopes. It was destroyed 3 days after that. The Vreth did not bother to communicate or demand surrender. They simply opened fire the moment the envoy ships came within weapons range. And within minutes, 12 ambassadors and 300 crew members were dead. The news reached the Grand Assembly like a shockwave, spreading through the corridors and chambers, and shattering the comfortable certainty that had defined life in the Conquered for 3 millennia. Alina was in her office when she heard, and she felt no satisfaction in being right because there was no victory in this kind of truth, only grief for the dead and fear for what was coming next. The Council called another emergency session, and this time every seat was filled, every delegate present, every face showing some version of shock or confusion or the beginning of real fear. High Arbiter Thesson opened the session with a voice that was less steady than before. The Council acknowledges the loss of our diplomatic envoy and extends condolences to the families of those who died in service to peace. Peace, Alina said, rising from her seat without permission because she was done with permission and protocols and proper procedures. There will be no peace with the Vreth. There was never going to be peace. I told you this weeks ago, and you refused to listen. Ambassador Vasquez, you are out of order, Thesson said, but there was less certainty in the reprimand than there once would have been. Yes, I am out of order because order is not going to save us from what is coming. Alina walked down the stairs toward the central platform, ignoring the protests of the delegates around her. I presented evidence of Vreth aggression and you dismissed it. I warned you that they would not negotiate, and you sent an envoy anyway. And now 12 good people are dead because you were too proud and too comfortable to face the truth. She reached the platform and turned to face the full assembly, seeing hundreds of alien faces staring back at her with expressions she could not fully read. The Vreth fleet is 4 weeks away from the outer colonies. 30 million humans live in those systems, and after they destroy us, they will move on to your worlds one by one until there is nothing left. The Torvani ambassador, a massive being with 6 arms and a face like a scarred boulder, spoke for the first time in any session Alina had attended. What would you have us do, human? We have no armies, no war fleets. We gave up such things long ago because we believed we had grown beyond them. Then you have to remember, Alina said. You have to remember what you were before you decided that peace meant pretending war did not exist. She looked around the chamber one more time, knowing that her words were falling on ears that might never truly hear, and then she turned and walked toward the exit. Where are you going? Thesson called after her. Alina paused at the door and looked back at the crystalline being who had led the galaxy into a comfortable blindness. I am going to do what the conquered will not. I am going to prepare my people for war. And with those words she left the chamber, and Marcus followed her, and together they made their way back to the Starward Hope with a terrible weight on their shoulders and a fierce determination in their hearts. Humanity would stand alone if it had to, but it would stand. The message went out across every human world at the same moment, carried by faster-than-light transmissions to colonies and stations and ships scattered across the darkness between stars. Alina had recorded it herself, sitting in a bare room on the Starward Hope with nothing but a camera and the weight of everything she needed to say. My fellow humans, she began, I am speaking to you today because a storm is coming. A threat unlike anything our species has ever faced, and the galaxy has chosen to look away while the darkness approaches. She told them about the Vreth and their conquests, about the Council and their blindness, about the fleet that was even now moving toward the outer colonies with 400 warships and a hunger for destruction. "We asked for help and help was denied," she said. "We presented evidence and evidence was ignored. We watched as diplomats were murdered and still the galaxy refuses to act, so now we must act ourselves." The message spread like fire across dry grass, jumping from world to world and station to station, until every human being in the galaxy had heard the ambassador's words. And something remarkable happened. On Earth, governments that had spent decades arguing over borders and resources and old grudges suddenly found common ground in the face of extinction. And within 3 days, the United Nations had granted emergency powers to a unified military command that brought together every fleet and army and militia under a single banner. On Mars, the terraforming engineers who had spent their lives making the red planet green turned their skills toward weapons research, and laboratories that had been working on atmosphere generators began designing shield technology and improved missiles. On Luna, the shipyards that built exploration vessels and cargo haulers and passenger liners received new orders, and workers began the around-the-clock shifts that would be needed to convert civilian ships into something that could fight. Alina returned to Earth aboard a fast courier ship, making the journey in just 4 days instead of the usual 2 weeks, and when she arrived, she found a world transformed by purpose. Admiral James Okonkwo met her at the spaceport in Geneva, a tall man with gray hair and scars on his face from a war that had ended 30 years before, and his handshake was firm and his eyes were steady. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, "I have read your reports and I believe everything you have told us, but I need you to understand what we are facing." They walked together through corridors filled with rushing officers and technicians, passing screens that showed fleet positions and production schedules, and casualty projections that made Alina's stomach turn. "We have 93 combat-capable vessels," Okonkwo continued. "The Vreth have 400 that we know of, probably more in reserve. Our technology is roughly equal, but their experience in actual warfare is vastly greater because we have not fought a real war in over a century." "So what do we do?" Alina asked. Okonkwo stopped walking and looked at her with the calm certainty of a man who had already made peace with what might come. "We do what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds. We fight anyway." The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity that seemed to compress time itself, every hour filled with 1,000 decisions and 1,000,000 small acts of courage from people who knew they might be preparing for their own deaths. Alina traveled from world to world, speaking to crowds of volunteers and workers and soldiers, reminding them why they fought and what they were protecting. On the mining colonies of the asteroid belt, she watched rough men and women who had spent their lives digging ore from rocks sign up for military service, their hands calloused from labor and their eyes bright with determination. On the research stations orbiting Jupiter, she saw scientists working without sleep to develop new weapons and countermeasures, pushing the boundaries of physics and engineering, because failure meant the end of everything. On the outer colonies themselves, she helped coordinate evacuation efforts for civilians who could not or would not fight, loading millions of people onto transport ships that would carry them to safer systems further from the approaching storm. But not everyone left. On Kelani's Prime, the largest of the outer colonies with a population of 18 million, Alina met a woman named Sarah Chen, who ran a small restaurant near the spaceport, and who had refused every offer of evacuation. "My grandfather built this restaurant when the colony was just a few domes on a barren rock," Sarah said as she served Alina a cup of tea. "He came here because he believed in the future, in building something that would last, and I am not going to abandon his dream because some aliens think they can take it from us." There were thousands like Sarah across the outer colonies, ordinary people who chose to stay and fight for their homes, and Alina drew strength from their courage even as she feared for their lives. Meanwhile, the Galactic Council continued to debate. Alina received regular updates from Marcus, who had stayed behind at the Grand Assembly to monitor developments, and each report was more frustrating than the last. "They are still discussing the proper response," Marcus told her during one late-night communication. Ambassador Krelvoth proposed a strongly worded resolution condemning the Vreth attack on the diplomatic envoy, and they have been arguing about the exact wording for 3 days. 3 days, Alina repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. "The Vreth fleet will reach Kalanis in 2 weeks, and they are arguing about words." "There is some movement among the Torvani delegation," Marcus added, a hint of hope in his voice. "Their ambassador has been asking questions about human military capabilities and seemed genuinely interested in the answers." The Torvani were an interesting case, Alina knew, because unlike most conquered species they had not always been peaceful, and their ancient history was filled with wars and conquests that they had supposedly moved beyond when they joined the galactic community. Perhaps they remembered something that the others had forgotten. Admiral Okonkwo presented his battle plan to Alina, and the unified command 3 days before the Vreth fleet was expected to arrive at Kalanis. "We cannot win a straight fight," he said, pointing to holographic displays that showed the relative positions of the 2 fleets. "They outnumber us 4-1, and their ships are designed for war while many of ours were passenger vessels a month ago." "Then how do we win?" asked General Martinez, the commander of ground forces. "We do not try to win," Okonkwo replied. "We try to survive. We make them pay for every inch of space. We hit them and run and hit them again until they bleed so much that continuing the attack becomes too costly." It was a desperate strategy, the kind of plan that only made sense when all other options had failed, but it was the only strategy they had. Alina looked at the faces around the table, soldiers and commanders and politicians who had come together in humanity's darkest hour, and she saw fear in their eyes but also something stronger. She saw resolve. "There is one more thing I need to do," she said. "Before the battle begins, I need to go back to the Grand Assembly and address the Council one more time." "Why?" Okonkwo asked. "They have made their position clear." "Because they need to hear the truth," Alina said. "Not reports or data or diplomatic language. They need someone to look them in the eyes and tell them exactly what they are facing. And maybe, just maybe, some of them will remember who they used to be." She left for the Grand Assembly the next morning, traveling aboard the fastest ship available, knowing that time was running out and that everything depended on what happened next. The Vreth were coming, and the galaxy needed to wake up. Alina was going to be the alarm. The council chamber was fuller than Alina had ever seen it, every seat occupied by delegates from all 47 member species, and the air itself seemed heavy with tension as she walked down the central stairs toward the speaking platform. She had requested this emergency session through official channels and had been surprised when High Arbiter Thesson granted it immediately. But she understood why when she looked up at the assembled beings and saw fear in faces that had never known fear before. Word had spread through the galaxy about humanity's preparations for war, about the ships being converted and the soldiers being trained and the ordinary people who had chosen to stay and fight, and it had disturbed the comfortable peace that the conquered had enjoyed for 3,000 years. The idea that anyone would actually fight, would actually choose violence over surrender or negotiation, was alien to these beings in a way that went beyond species or biology. Alina reached the platform and stood there for a moment, looking around at the crystalline forms and liquid metal bodies and logical minds that had ruled the galaxy for longer than humanity had existed as a species. She had prepared remarks, carefully written speeches designed to appeal to their sense of reason and self-interest. But standing there in that moment, she realized that careful words were not going to be enough. They needed to feel something, needed to understand in their hearts what their minds refused to accept. "You are afraid," she said, her voice echoing through the vast chamber. "I can see it in the way you sit, in the way you look at me, in the silence that fills this room like water filling a sinking ship." A murmur went through the assembly, but no one interrupted her. "You are afraid because you have heard what humanity is doing, because you cannot understand why we would choose to fight when the odds are so clearly against us, because the very concept of war is something you have tried so hard to forget." She activated the holographic displays around her, showing images of human ships gathering at Kelani's, of soldiers training in the corridors of stations, of civilians refusing to evacuate their homes. "In 4 days, the Vreth fleet will arrive at the Kelani system, 400 warships against our 93, and they will try to burn everything we have built in that corner of space." "Ambassador Vasquez," High Arbiter Thesson said, "if you have come to request military assistance from the conquered, you must understand that we simply do not have." "I have not come to request anything," Alina interrupted, her voice sharp and strong. "I am done requesting, done begging, done trying to convince beings who have chosen blindness over sight." The chamber went completely silent. "I have come to tell you what humanity is going to do, and to give you one final chance to remember what you have forgotten." She walked to the edge of the platform and pointed up at the assembled delegates, her finger moving from section to section as she spoke. "The Synthari were conquerors once. Your history records tell of the logic wars when your ancestors swept across a dozen star systems in pursuit of perfect order. You gave up war because you calculated that peace was more efficient, not because you were incapable of violence." Ambassador Krelvoth shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but did not respond. "The Melori evolved in the depths of volcanic oceans, fighting every day just to survive against predators and pressure and heat that would kill any human in seconds. You did not become what you are through peace, but through struggle." The liquid metal delegate rippled but remained silent. "And the Torvani?" Alina turned to face the massive six-armed beings who sat in their section like statues carved from living stone. "Your ancestors conquered half a galaxy before you joined the conquered. You were the most feared warriors in known space, and now you sit in comfortable chairs pretending you have evolved beyond such primitive behavior." The Torvani ambassador stirred, his deep voice rumbling through the chamber. "You speak boldly for one so young, human." "I speak the truth," Alina replied, "which is more than this council has done since I arrived." She turned back to face Thesson, the crystalline being who had led the galaxy into 3,000 years of peace and was now watching that peace crumble. "You built the conquered on a beautiful idea, the belief that intelligent beings could choose cooperation over conflict, that war was a disease that civilization could cure, but you made a terrible mistake." Alina paused, letting the silence stretch until every being in the chamber was focused entirely on her. "You assumed that everyone else shared your belief. You assumed that every species in the galaxy would eventually see the wisdom of peace. You forgot that some beings do not want peace. Some beings only understand strength, and some beings will keep taking and killing and conquering until someone stops them." She activated the final holographic display, showing the Vreth war fleet in all its terrible glory, 400 ships bristling with weapons, and filled with soldiers who had been raised from birth to believe that conquest was their divine right. "The Vreth are coming, and they will not stop at the outer colonies. After they destroy us, they will move on to the Kelani system, and then to Synthari Prime, and then to every world in the conquered, until there is nothing left but their empire." "What would you have us do?" Thesson asked, and for the first time there was something other than calm certainty in the Arbiter's voice. "We have no weapons, no armies. We gave them up long ago." "Then remember how to fight," Alina said. "Remember what your ancestors knew. Remember that peace is not the absence of war but the victory over it. Remember that freedom is not given but earned. She straightened her back and spoke the words that would echo through galactic history, the words that every child in every civilization would learn for generations to come. "The time for diplomacy has ended," she declared, her voice ringing through the chamber like a bell. "The time for war has come." The chamber erupted in chaos, delegates shouting in a dozen languages, some calling for her removal and others sitting in stunned silence. But Alina stood firm at the center of the storm. "Humanity will fight," she continued, raising her voice above the noise. "We will meet the Vreth at Kalani's and we will hold them there or we will die trying. We are not asking for your permission. We are not requesting your approval. We are telling you that this is what we are going to do." She looked around the chamber one more time, meeting every eye she could find. "And we are asking if you want to survive, because if we fall you are next, and you have forgotten how to defend yourselves." For a long moment no one moved. The future of the galaxy balanced on a knife's edge, and then something remarkable happened. The Torvani ambassador rose from his seat, all 6 of his massive arms spreading wide in a gesture that Alina did not recognize, but that sent a gasp through the chamber. "The human speaks truth," the Torvani said, his deep voice silencing every other sound. "We have grown soft. We have forgotten the lessons our ancestors paid for in blood. We have hidden from this threat because we were afraid to remember what we once were." He turned to face Alina, and in his ancient eyes she saw something that had been sleeping for a very long time, finally beginning to wake. "The Torvani will fight alongside humanity," he declared. "We will remember who we were, and we will show these Vreth what happens to those who threaten the innocent." The chamber exploded into noise again, but this time it was different. This time there was something else mixed with the fear and confusion. Hope. One by one, other delegations began to rise, the Kreth with their armored shells and the Valorians with their gleaming weapons, and even the logical Synthari who had calculated the odds and realized that unity was their only chance of survival. By the time the session ended, 23 species had pledged their support to the war effort, ships and soldiers and resources that would join humanity's desperate stand against the darkness. Alina watched them go, watched beings who had never known war begin to prepare for battle, and she felt the weight of what she had done settle onto her shoulders. She had changed the galaxy with her words, had awakened something that had been sleeping for 3,000 years, and now she had to make sure that awakening was not in vain. The Battle of Kalani's was 4 days away, and everything depended on what happened next. The stars around Kalani's prime were filled with ships, human vessels flying alongside Torvani warships and Synthari cruisers and craft from a dozen other species, all of them waiting in formation for an enemy that would arrive at any moment. Admiral James Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance, humanity's flagship, watching the tactical displays that showed the positions of every ship in the combined fleet, 260 vessels against the Vreth armada of 400. The odds were still terrible, but they were better than they had been a week ago when humanity had stood alone. "Admiral, the Vreth fleet has entered the system," reported his tactical officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Park, whose hands were steady despite the fear that must have been running through her veins. "They will be in weapons range in 20 minutes. Okonkwo nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the red dots that represented death and destruction approaching at incredible speed. "Signal all ships to hold formation. Nobody fires until I give the order." Around him, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, humans and aliens operating together in ways that would have seemed impossible just weeks before, and Okonkwo felt a strange pride in what they had accomplished. The Torvani warriors who manned the secondary weapon stations were fierce beings who had rediscovered their warrior heritage. Their 6 arms moving across control panels, with a speed and precision that human hands could never match. The Centauri analysts who calculated firing solutions and predicted enemy movements were cold and logical but absolutely reliable, their minds processing data faster than any computer. The Mallory engineers who kept the ship running had literally merged themselves with the engine systems, their liquid metal bodies flowing through conduits and cables to make repairs that would normally take hours in mere minutes. They were different species from different worlds with different histories, but in this moment they were one fleet fighting for one cause. Ambassador Elena Vasquez's face appeared on the main view screen, broadcasting from the command ship at the rear of the formation, where she had insisted on being despite every argument Okonkwo had made about her safety. "Admiral, the Vreth commander is attempting to communicate," she said. "I think they want to offer us one last chance to surrender." "Put them through," Okonkwo said. "Let everyone hear what we are fighting against." The Vreth commander appeared on screen, the same terrible figure from the message that had started everything, scales dark as space and eyes empty of anything resembling mercy. "You have gathered allies," the commander observed with what might have been amusement. "It will not matter, you are still weak, still divided, still clinging to the pathetic hope that you can resist the inevitable." Elena stepped forward so that the Vreth could see her clearly. "This is Ambassador Elena Vasquez of the Human Coalition, speaking for the United Fleet of the Galactic Concord." "I remember you," the commander said. "You were the one who tried to warn them, the one they did not believe. A pity they did not listen. You might have had more time to prepare." "They listened eventually," Elena replied. "And now we are here not to negotiate, not to surrender, but to fight." "You will die." "Maybe," Elena acknowledged. "But we will not die quietly, and we will not die alone, and before this day is over you will learn something that your species has forgotten." "And what is that?" Elena's voice was cold and hard as steel when she answered, "That there are worse things in the galaxy than the Vreth." The channel cut off and the battle began. The first wave of Vreth ships came in fast and aggressive, expecting the Allied fleet to break and scatter as every other enemy had done. But the combined forces held their formation and met the attack with concentrated fire. Human missiles and Torvani plasma weapons and Centauri precision lasers tore through the Vreth vanguard, destroying ships that had expected easy targets and found instead a wall of death. The Defiance led the charge, Okonkwo pushing his ship into the heart of the enemy formation, in a move so reckless that the Vreth commanders could not process it, and where the flagship went the rest of the fleet followed. Ships exploded on both sides, brief flowers of fire blooming in the darkness only to fade into nothing, and with each death the survivors fought harder knowing that their fallen comrades had bought them precious seconds. The Torvani warships were brutal in close combat, their crews boarding enemy vessels and fighting hand to hand through corridors filled with smoke and blood, and the ancient warriors showed the Vreth what 3,000 years of suppressed aggression looked like when finally released. The Centauri worked together in perfect coordination, their ships moving as one mind, predicting enemy movements and exploiting weaknesses with mathematical precision that turned the chaos of battle into something almost beautiful. Even the peaceful Mallory contributed, their shape-shifting bodies forming living shields around damaged ships, absorbing weapons fire until they could absorb no more and sacrificing themselves, so that others might survive. But the Vreth kept coming, wave after wave of ships pouring into the battle zone, and slowly the Allied fleet began to take losses that could not be replaced. Okonkwo watched as ship after ship fell silent on his tactical display, human and alien crews dying together in the cold void of space, and he knew that the battle could not continue much longer. "Admiral, we are losing cohesion on the left flank," Lieutenant Park reported, her voice strained but steady. "The Kreth squadron has taken heavy damage." "Send the reserve wing to reinforce them," Okonkwo ordered, "and signal the Defiant squadron to begin attack pattern Omega." Attack Pattern Omega was a desperate gamble, a final push that would drive the flagship and its escorts directly at the Vreth command ship in hopes of cutting off the head of the enemy fleet. It was almost certainly a suicide mission, and everyone on the bridge knew it. "Admiral," the communications officer called out, "Ambassador Vasquez is requesting to speak with you." Okonkwo activated the private channel, and Alina's face appeared on his personal screen, her expression a mixture of grief and determination. "You are going after their flagship," she said, and it was not a question. "It is the only way," Okonkwo replied. "If we can destroy their commander, the rest of the fleet may retreat. And if you die, then I die doing what humans have always done," the admiral said with a sad smile, "fighting for what I believe in." Alina was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice was thick with emotion. "It has been an honor, Admiral." "The honor was mine, Ambassador. Tell them what happened here. Tell them that we did not go quietly." The channel closed, and Okonkwo turned to his crew, seeing the faces of men and women and beings who had chosen to follow him into the darkness. "All hands, this is the Admiral," he announced over the ship-wide communication system. "We are about to do something very stupid and very brave. Anyone who wants to leave is free to do so. No one will think less of you." No one moved. "Then let us show these Vreth what happens when you threaten humanity." The Defiance surged forward, engines burning at maximum power, and its escort ships followed in a wedge formation that cut through the enemy fleet like a blade. Vreth vessels tried to intercept them, but the human ships were faster and more maneuverable, weaving through weapons, fire, and debris with a skill that came from desperation and determination. The enemy flagship grew larger on the viewscreen, a massive vessel bristling with weapons that could destroy a planet, and Okonkwo knew that they would only get one chance. "All weapons, fire everything," he ordered, and the Defiance unleashed a storm of missiles and energy beams that lit up the darkness like a second sun. The Vreth flagship's shields flickered and died under the concentrated assault, and for one perfect moment Okonkwo could see the hull beginning to buckle under the pressure. Then a Vreth cruiser slammed into the Defiance from behind, and the world became fire and pain. The explosion of the two ships triggered a chain reaction that engulfed the Vreth flagship as well, and when the light faded there was nothing left but expanding clouds of debris. Across the battlefield, the Vreth fleet hesitated. Their commander was dead, their flagship destroyed, and the enemy they had expected to roll over was still fighting with a ferocity they had never encountered. One by one, the Vreth ships began to break off, turning away from the battle and retreating toward the edge of the system, and a ragged cheer went up from the surviving Allied vessels. They had won. The Battle of Kelanis was over, and though the cost had been terrible, the combined fleet had achieved the impossible and turned back the darkness. Alina Vasquez watched from her command ship as the Vreth fleet disappeared into hyperspace, carrying word of their defeat back to their homeworld, and she wept for all those who had died to make this moment possible. 1 month later, she stood before the Galactic Council once more, but this time everything was different. A new seat had been added to the inner circle of the chamber, a seat for humanity, and Alina took her place there among the elder races who had finally remembered what it meant to fight. High Arbiter Theson's crystalline form chimed softly as the session began. "The Council formally recognizes the human coalition as a full member of the Galactic Concord. Your people have shown us something we had forgotten, that peace is not the absence of strength but its highest expression." Alina thought of Admiral Okonkwo and the thousands who had given their lives at Kelanis, of the long road that still lay ahead because the Vreth were wounded but not destroyed, and she knew that the galaxy would never be the same. "We did not come to the stars to conquer," she said quietly. "We came to find our place among you. We came as friends and explorers. But know this, we will never hesitate to fight for what we believe in." She looked around the chamber at the allies who had been forged in fire, at beings who had remembered their ancient strength, because a young species had reminded them of what courage looked like. And now neither will you. The galaxy had changed, the age of comfortable peace was over, and a new era had begun. An era where humanity stood among the stars not as newcomers, but as equals, not as observers but as leaders, not as children but as warriors who had shown the ancient races that sometimes the youngest voice speaks the loudest truth. The age of humanity had begun, and the stars themselves seemed to shine a little brighter in welcome.